A young couple vanished without a trace one summer night. No witnesses, no clues, and a baby boy left behind with no memory of who he truly was. 26 years later, their car is found buried deep in the forest. And what investigators uncover inside changes everything. This isn't just a mystery, it's a story about family, betrayal, and a truth that refused to stay buried. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where in the world are you watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Now, settle in, because this is a journey you won't forget. On a warm August evening in 1998, Tom and Grace Whitaker left a cozy lakeside in just outside Lassane National Park, waving goodbye to the elderly innkeeper and promising to return. The next summer, the young couple, both in their early 30s, had just celebrated their second wedding anniversary. Grace wore a blue sundress that fluttered in the evening breeze, and Tom had his arm loosely around her shoulders as they climbed into their silver 1997 Honda Accord. They were the picture of happiness, of simplicity, of the kind of love that seemed to slow time around them. But that was the last moment anyone would ever see them. When they didn't show up the next morning at Tom's workplace, his boss assumed they'd decided to extend their weekend. But when they missed a family gathering the following evening, one Grace never would have skipped concern began to bloom. Phone calls went unanswered. Friends visited their home in Cottonwood, but everything was in place, as if the couple had simply planned to come right back. Mail piled up. Grace's mother, Eleanor, filed the missing persons report 3 days later, her hands trembling as she clutched the photo of her only daughter and the son-in-law she'd come to love like her own. The sheriff's department launched a full search. Helicopters swept over the dense forest surrounding Highway 44. Volunteers walked the trails with dogs and flashlights, calling out their names long into the night. Rangers scoured campgrounds, riverbanks, and abandoned roads, but the forest gave up nothing. No sign of a car, no evidence of foul play. It was as if Tom and Grace had vanished into thin air, swallowed whole by the wilderness, or spirited away by something the law couldn't see. Weeks turned into months, and months into years. The story of the Whitakers became a kind of folklore. In Shasta County, their framed photos rested on mantels, worn and faded by the hands of time and grief. Grace's mother never stopped searching, writing 2 local papers every year on the anniversary of their disappearance, begging the public for any scrap of information. She even hired private investigators, but none found anything beyond what the sheriff's team had already uncovered. Absolutely nothing. Eventually, people stopped talking about the case. New tragedies came, new names filled the news. The world moved on, but for the people who loved Tom and Grace, time stood still. There were whispers, of course. Some believed they had staged their own disappearance, perhaps to escape debts or family tensions. Others claimed they'd witnessed something they shouldn't have, and paid the price. A few even wondered if Tom had done something terrible in a moment of rage, but none of it made sense. Not to those who knew them. Tom was gentle, steady. Grace was warm, grounded, with a laugh that made people turn round just to see where the light was coming from. They had no reason to run, no enemies, no secrets, at least none anyone could imagine, and still they were gone. Then, in the spring of 2020, 26 years after the Whitakers disappeared, fate decided to speak. It was a Monday morning. Quiet, except for the buzz of heavy machinery on the edge of Reading, where a new housing development was in its early stages. A backhoe operator, working through dry layers of reddish clay, struck something solid. At first, he thought it was a large rock, but the metallic thud told a different story. Dust was kicked up as the bucket scraped against an old, rust-stained bumper. A familiar shape emerged for tires, a crumpled fender, glass crushed flat against the roof. Within minutes, the site supervisor halted all work and called the sheriff's office. By early afternoon, yellow tape cordoned off the area, and investigators stared at the eerie sight of a fully buried car, its frame twisted with time. A tow truck was called in to extract it from the earth. A slow and careful process watched by reporters and neighbors who had begun to gather. When the car was finally lifted into the air, covered in dirt and silence, one deputy read the faded license plate aloud. The words caught in his throat. It was the Whitakers' Honda Accord. The news spread like wildfire. Reporters dug out old headlines from dusty archives. Grace's mother, now living in a nursing facility, was informed just before the evening news aired. Her hands trembled again, but this time from something closer to hope than grief. "My Gracie," she whispered, eyes fixed on the flickering screen. They found her car. The sheriff's department confirmed the match within hours. Cross-referenced VIN numbers and previous DMV records. The car had not been moved since 1998. It had been deliberately buried off a disused access road that had long since grown over, concealed by shrubs and brush, and forgotten as the area was rezoned for development. There had been no indication of its presence, no mound, no markers, no sign it had ever been there. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide it. But what truly stunned investigators wasn't just the discovery of the car. It was what they found inside. And in that instant, the mystery that had haunted a community for over 2 decades deepened into something no one could have imagined. The sun was barely rising over the jagged ridgelines of Reading when the phone rang at the Shasta County Sheriff's Office, its shrill tone cutting through the quiet like a knife. Deputy Marshal Keith Harlan, a 28-year veteran with silver hair and a voice that never rose above a calm murmur, picked up. On the other end, a gravelly voice belonging to the site foreman of Ridgeview Estates sounded shaken. "We hit something," the man said, pausing. "It's a car, buried. We think it's been there a long time." Harlan, who had heard all kinds of stories over the years, grabbed his jacket without another word. But something about the way the man's voice trembled settled uneasily in his gut. Within the hour, the construction site, once buzzing with the rhythmic hum of machinery, had fallen silent. Bulldozers stood frozen, their massive blades poised mid-air. Workers gathered in clusters near the edge of a large excavation pit, where the front half of an old silver Honda Accord jutted from the red earth like a fossil. The paint was blistered and faded, the windshield caved in, and its once proud license plate hung at an angle, crusted in layers of dirt. But even before they wiped it clean, someone had already whispered the impossible: the Whitaker car. As investigators swarmed the scene, journalists began to arrive, their vans forming a crooked line along the edge of the construction fence. By midday, the story had exploded across local news. Car linked to 1998, missing couple found buried in Reading. Onlookers leaned over barricades, murmuring among themselves about where they'd been the day the Whitakers vanished. People who had long forgotten the case now stared wide-eyed at the grainy yearbook photos of Tom and Grace plastered on TV screens. But what most didn't know, at least not yet, was that what lay inside the vehicle would soon turn a forgotten tragedy into a mystery so strange, so haunting, that it would grip the nation for weeks. Sheriff Lena Groves arrived at the site. Personally, a sharp-witted woman in her 50s, Lena had been a rookie deputy when the Whitakers disappeared. She remembered the case like it had happened yesterday, the endless forest searches, Grace's mother's tearful interviews, the headlines that slowly shrank smaller and smaller until they disappeared altogether. She stood in the dirt, arms crossed, staring at the half-exposed vehicle, the summer heat pressing down like a hand on her neck. "Let's lift it out," she said quietly. The car was winched out slowly, soil falling in sheets from its undercarriage. The tires had long since deflated into rubber husks. Its windows, shattered but sealed by mud, offered only glimpses of the interior. Once the vehicle was fully extracted and placed onto a transport trailer, investigators suited up and began the delicate process of opening the doors. The smell was the first thing to hit them, a sickly, sweet odor of decay, muted by time and soil, but unmistakable. Inside, in the front seats, were the skeletal remains of 2 people. They were seated upright, their seatbelts still buckled across their fragile forms. Time had done its slow work. Their clothes had rotted, but fragments remained: Tom's leather belt buckle, Grace's locket, a single gold wedding band still clinging to bone. There was no sign of struggle, no broken bones, no blood, just stillness. It was as though they'd pulled over to rest and never awoke. But behind the driver's seat, wedged beneath a warped section of the floor mat, an object gleamed faintly in the shifting lighter metal briefcase, small, heavy, and locked shut. For a moment, no one said anything. Then Deputy Harlan, hands gloved and trembling slightly, lifted it carefully and placed it into an evidence bag. Back at the sheriff's office, it took less than 5 minutes to pry open. What spilled out were items so unexpected, they silenced the room. First, a stack of faded photographs. In every picture, Tom and Grace smiled wide, their arms wrapped around each other or wrapped around a small infant no more than a few weeks old. The baby, with chubby cheeks and a small birthmark on his left wrist, appeared in photo after photo, on a picnic blanket, in a motel room, in a rustic cabin bathed in golden afternoon light. And then, the birth certificate, issued by the state of California, though not officially registered in any current hospital system, read Lucas Whitaker, born June 10, 1998, mother, Grace Whitaker, father, Thomas Whitaker. Investigators stared at it, stunned. Publicly, there had never been mention of a baby. Grace's mother had never reported her pregnant. None of the Whitakers' friends or co-workers had spoken of a child. There had been no car seat listed in the missing persons report, no baby, clothes packed in the luggage found at their home. And yet, there he was, in photograph after photograph, nestled in Grace's arms. Along with the documents and pictures were $10,000 in cash and several handwritten letters, yellowing, but neatly folded. The contents of those letters would take days to piece through. But one thing was immediately clear. The Whitakers had not disappeared alone. Somewhere out there, if he was still alive, a third person had survived the trip. The baby. The sheriff's office called a press conference that evening, but details were scarce. They confirmed the vehicle had been identified as the Whitakers' missing Honda Accord and that remains were discovered inside. Nothing more. But inside the small briefing room, Sheriff Groves couldn't stop staring at the photograph they'd pinned to the wall, the one of Grace holding her baby, eyes full of joy, sunlight warming her hair, completely unaware that her story was about to become the subject of the most shocking mystery in Shasta County's history. And so the question that had haunted the town for 26 years took on a chilling new shape. Tom and Grace were finally found, but the baby Lucas was missing, and someone, somewhere, had buried that car, locking away a secret that was only now beginning to claw its way back into the light. The briefcase sat unopened on the steel evidence table, like it had been waiting for this moment for 26 years. Sheriff Lena Groves stood beside it, arms folded tightly against her chest, her brow drawn with the tension of a woman who knew that what they were about to uncover might not just answer old questions, but unravel new ones far stranger than any they had imagined. Deputy Harlan carefully inserted the small pry tool into the lock, twisting until the latch gave way with a soft metallic click. The lid lifted slowly, releasing a faint scent of must and old paper, and for a moment no one spoke. Then they began to pull the contents out, piece by piece, each item more perplexing than the last dot. The photographs came first, dozens of them, curled at the edges, their color faded by time but still vivid enough to tell a story. In every photo, Tom and Grace appeared radiant with joy, their expressions full of warmth and the kind of tender love only new parents seemed to wear. But it was the baby in the pictures who stunned them, most a chubby-cheeked infant with bright eyes and a birthmark just beneath his left wrist. The child looked to be no older than a few weeks, wrapped in blankets, nestled in Grace's arms, resting against Tom's shoulder, smiling under the sun in what appeared to be a forest clearing. There were no hospital ID bracelets, no incubators, or sterile white walls, just them, the trees, and that baby Dot. Then came the official-looking document, folded with care but now yellowed at the seams. A birth certificate, name Lucas Whitaker, born June 10, 1998. Parents, Thomas and Grace Whitaker. Place of birth, private residence, Cottonwood, CA. It bore a seal, faint but legible. Yet when investigators cross-checked it with state records, no matching registration could be found. There was no trace of Lucas in any hospital log, no pediatrician visits, no health insurance. According to the system, Lucas Whitaker had never existed. Sheriff Groves sat down slowly, the paper resting on her lap. If they had a child, she murmured, why didn't anyone know? It didn't make sense. Grace's mother had never mentioned a pregnancy. Their friends hadn't seen her showing. Tom's co-workers said he spoke of weekend fishing trips and fixing up the house, not preparing for fatherhood. Yet the evidence was right there, in those photos, in that certificate, in the way Grace looked at her child like he was her whole world. They kept digging. Tucked inside a small envelope at the bottom of the briefcase were several handwritten letters. The first was addressed to Eleanor Franklin, Grace's mother. The writing was unmistakably Grace's, delicate loops of ink dancing across the page. In it, she wrote of fear and excitement, of the decision to keep the pregnancy secret, and of plans to leave town before anyone could interfere. We wanted a clean start, the letter read, away from judgment, away from pressure. We were going to Oregon. We didn't tell you because we knew you'd try to stop us, not out of cruelty, but because you'd worry. Please forgive us. The letter ended with a shaky line. If something happens, please know we did everything out of love." The room fell silent as that letter was passed from hand to hand. What once had been a straightforward missing persons case was now a layered mystery. Not only had Tom and Grace vanished, they had done so with a child no one knew existed. And if the couple's remains had been found buckled into the front seats of that buried car, where had the baby gone? There had been no child's car seat in the back, no remains, no clothing, no sign a baby had ever been in that vehicle. And yet the photos told a different story. The investigators reviewed the positioning of the bodies again. They looked for any hint of another occupant, but the evidence was consistent. The child hadn't been in the car when it was buried, which led to the next chilling question: who had taken him out? In the following hours, the forensic team analyzed every inch of the briefcase and the surrounding area of the car. They found a partial fingerprint on one of the letters and they recovered strands of hair, mostly belonging to Grace, but one tiny lock that forensic analysts suspected could belong to the baby. Sheriff Groves ordered immediate DNA testing, sending samples to both the state lab and the national database. "Run it against everything," she said. "Adoption records, criminal records, anything." But she knew results would take time, and every hour that passed allowed more questions to fester. The media, meanwhile, had latched on to the discovery with a fervor that left no room for privacy. Cable news anchors speculated wildly. Talk radio lit up with callers claiming to have known Tom or Grace, or insisting they had seen a baby matching that description in the early 2000s. The sheriff's office, overwhelmed, issued a carefully worded press release. "We have reason to believe that a third individual may have been involved. The investigation remains active. Anyone with information should contact our office immediately." But behind closed doors, the investigators weren't just working on clues, they were grappling with a haunting possibility. If Tom and Grace had been murdered and their car buried to erase all trace of them, then someone had made a conscious decision to take that child and leave him alive. Why? That night, Sheriff Groves returned to her office and stood in front of the evidence board. Tacked to the center was a photo of the baby Lucas, smiling up at the camera. Unaware of the storm that would one day surround his tiny face, she couldn't stop staring at his eyes. There was something about them, something eerily familiar, though she couldn't say why. What she did know, deep in her bones, was this: someone had gone to great lengths to erase the Whitakers, but they hadn't erased everything. They had left behind a child, and now, 26 years later, that secret was clawing its way to the surface and, with it, the truth. The small conference room at the sheriff's office had become a shrine to unanswered questions. The photos of Tom, Grace, and baby Lucas now took up an entire wall, flanked by timelines, maps, and notes scribbled in red marker. Sheriff Groves stared at the board with a quiet intensity, her arms crossed, her coffee long since gone cold. The pieces were forming a pattern, but the shape of it still eluded her. She kept coming back to the same question: where was the child? And if he hadn't died with his parents in that buried car, then who had taken him and why? The autopsy reports came back later that afternoon, and though they offered clarity, they brought no comfort. The skeletal remains confirmed what they already knew: the victims were Tom and Grace Whitaker. Both had died of carbon monoxide poisoning. No broken bones, no signs of trauma, no gunshot wounds, just silent, suffocating gas in a sealed space. It was likely the engine had been left running in an enclosed area, deliberately or through tragic mistake. But what unraveled the theory of accident was the state of the vehicle itself. The engine had been turned off. The car was buried, deep, purposefully. The soil had been packed with machinery, not natural erosion. And that meant someone had taken their lifeless bodies, sealed them inside, and hidden them forever. Someone who had a reason to make them disappear. But that someone had not buried a child. The investigators returned to the contents of the briefcase, this time focusing on the sealed letter marked Lucas open. "When you're older." Sheriff Groves hesitated, then unfolded it gently. Grace's handwriting ran neat and deliberate, as if she had written it during one of those quiet moments all new mothers treasure. "If you're reading this, my sweet boy," the letter began, "it means you've grown up, and we didn't get to see you do it." She wrote of how much they loved him, how they were scared but hopeful. "We were trying to get away from something," she continued, "from someone. We wanted to keep you safe. That was always the plan." Then came a line that made Groves pause. "If anything happens to us, I pray someone kind finds you and gives you a chance to live a full life." It was as close to a goodbye as any mother should ever have to write. And suddenly, the story was no longer just a cold case, it was a legacy. The forensic team discovered another detail that had gone unnoticed. Embedded in the fabric under the passenger seat was a single infant-sized sock, faded blue with tiny stars stitched into the edge. It was physical proof that Lucas had been in the car at some point, but still not when it was buried. Groves ordered the surrounding area of the burial site scanned again. Ground radar, cadaver dogs, everything. But no other remains were found. No makeshift grave, no evidence of a child's body. The truth was undeniable. Lucas had been taken out of that car before it vanished underground. That made him the third passenger, the one who'd survived. But how? The sheriff's department turned to the original missing persons file. Buried in a box of yellowing documents was a statement given by a waitress in Reading the day after. Tom and Grace had gone missing. She had claimed to have seen them sitting in a booth, sharing a meal with a baby in a carrier. It was dismissed at the time because the couple was believed to be childless. Now, her words rang with new weight. She remembered Grace feeding the baby with a bottle, Tom smiling as he rocked the carrier with his foot. She also remembered a man watching them from the bar. Rough-looking, she'd said. Older, angry eyes. She hadn't thought much of it, but maybe she should have. Intrigued, Groves ordered a re-interview. The waitress, now retired and living in Modesto, vividly recalled that night. She remembered that the man had paid with cash, wore a ball cap pulled low, and had a large mark, maybe a burn or birthmark, on the left side of his neck. It was a detail no one could fabricate after all these years. That single description opened a door, long sealed. The team cross-referenced old police files and mug shots from the 1990s. One photo stood out. Dean Whitaker, Tom's older brother, arrested for assault in 1995, bitter, volatile, and estranged from the family. According to statements from the time, Dean had fallen out with Tom over a disputed inheritance after their father's death. He accused Tom of manipulating their parents into cutting him out of the will. Several witnesses had described shouting matches and threats, including one where Dean allegedly said, "You took what's mine. I'll take everything from you." But Dean had died in a car crash in 2002, his file long closed and forgotten. Yet now, his name rose from the ashes like a ghost. Sheriff Groves stood by the photo board, her eyes drifting from Dean's scarred face to the photo of baby Lucas. If Dean had discovered their plan to leave town, if he had confronted them, what had happened next? Had he forced them into that car, watched them die, then buried their remains to cover it all up? Had he taken the child in some twisted sense of justice, or simply to get rid of him? And if so, what had he done with him afterward? There was only one path forward. They would run DNA from the hair recovered from the briefcase against every available national database. They would contact adoption agencies, hospitals, fire departments. Anywhere an infant might have been dropped off in 1998, they would search records, state by state if they had to, because someone out there might be walking around right now, unaware that he was born into a story stained by silence, loss, and buried secrets. Sheriff Groves looked again at the boy in the photo, Lucas Whitaker, the third passenger. He had been the one to make it out, and now, after all these years, the world might finally be closing in on the truth of where he had gone. The afternoon sunlight poured in through the wide windows of the Shasta Pines Assisted Living Center, casting soft golden squares across the carpet. Eleanor Franklin sat quietly in a high-backed armchair, her frail hands folded in her lap, a shawl draped over her narrow shoulders. Her white hair, neatly pinned, glowed like snow in the warm light. When Sheriff Groves entered the room, Eleanor looked up slowly, her eyes cloudy with age, but still sharp with something underneath, something unspoken, something buried. The sheriff took a seat across from her and placed a manila folder on the table between them. Neither of them spoke for a moment. It was Eleanor who broke the silence first, her voice barely more than a whisper. "It's about my Gracie, isn't it?" Groves nodded. She had always known this moment would come. Eleanor had been one of the loudest voices pushing for the search in the days and weeks after Tom and Grace vanished. She'd stood in front of cameras, spoken to reporters, begged strangers for tips. But now, 2 decades later, she looked like someone who'd waited so long for the truth that she'd made peace with never receiving it. Groves opened the folder and slid a photograph across the table, one of the recently recovered images from the briefcase. Grace, barefoot in a cabin doorway, holding a baby wrapped in a soft yellow blanket. Her smile was wide, but her eyes held something else. Determination, fear, a mother's resolve. Eleanor stared at the photo for a long time, her expression unreadable. Then she closed her eyes. "I knew," she said softly. "Not everything, but I knew she was pregnant. She came to me in May that year. She was already showing, but barely. Said she hadn't gone to the doctor because she was afraid." Her voice trembled. "Tom's father, Leonard, he didn't want them to have children. Said they weren't ready. Said it would ruin their chances of getting out of debt. He had control over their finances, even after Tom moved out. They were always worried he'd cut them off." Groves leaned in slightly, "So she hid it." Eleanor nodded, a single tear sliding down her cheek. "She told me not to say a word to anyone, not even to Tom's family. She said they had a plan, that once the baby was born, they'd go away for a while, get on their feet, then come back when they were ready. She begged me to trust her, and I did. I thought she'd be safe." The room grew still. Outside, wind rustled the leaves on the tall pines. Groves sat back, letting the silence settle between them. Then she asked the question she had come to ask. "Did you ever meet the baby?" Eleanor didn't answer immediately. Her fingers moved slowly over the fabric of her dress, as if remembering a smaller hand once held there. "She gave birth at home," she finally said. "In the guest bedroom. I was the only one there. It was early, but the baby was healthy. A boy. She named him Lucas, said it was the name they'd picked out together." Her voice cracked, then raw with memory. "She stayed for 3 days. Then one morning, they packed up the car and drove off. Said they were heading to Oregon, that they'd call when they got there, but they never did. I thought maybe they changed their minds. Maybe they just wanted a new life. I never imagined." Her words dissolved into a silence too deep to disturb. Groves placed a hand gently on Eleanor's. "You weren't wrong to trust her," she said. "Grace was doing what she thought was right for her child. We believe something happened after she left your house, something involving Tom's brother, Dean." Eleanor's face tightened. "Dean," she repeated, her voice suddenly sharper. "That boy was trouble from the moment he was born. Always angry, always jealous. Leonard treated him like a shadow, but he hated Tom for it." She shook her head. "Gracie was afraid of Dean. She told me he'd shown up unannounced a few times, said strange things, asked questions she didn't want to answer." Her eyes widened then, as if a memory had just returned. "He came by once, the day before they left. I thought it was coincidence. He said he was just passing through, but he kept looking at the baby, holding him too long. I told Tom later, but he brushed it off." Groves leaned forward, heart pounding. "You never told the police any of this?" Eleanor shook her head. "I was ashamed. I thought I'd broken their trust. And then when they vanished, I thought maybe they didn't want to be found." Her voice lowered to a whisper. "I didn't want to believe the worst." There was no judgment in Groves' eyes, only understanding. "You were trying to protect your daughter's memory," she said quietly. "But now, Eleanor, we need to protect her son. We believe Lucas survived. We think someone took him that day, and we're doing everything we can to find him." At that, Eleanor pressed the photograph to her chest. "If he's alive," she said, "you tell him his mama loved him. She loved him more than anything in this world." When Groves stood to leave, Eleanor didn't rise. She simply sat there, rocking gently, eyes closed, as if holding on to that last piece of her daughter for just a little longer. Outside, the sun dipped lower behind the trees, casting long shadows across the pine-needled ground. The past had stirred, and with it came the realization that even the most carefully buried secrets have a way of reaching toward the light. And now, with the grandmother's truth finally spoken, the next step in the long and winding road to uncovering what happened to baby Lucas had become clearer. Somewhere out there was a man who had no idea who he really was. But soon, very soon, that would begin to change. The small town of Cottonwood had grown quiet over the years, its main street lined with antique shops, dusty hardware stores, and diners that still served coffee for under $2. But tucked behind a weathered auto garage on Pine Street, Saturday, a faded two-story house, its front porch sagging, its paint peeling like tired skin. It was there, just after dawn, that Sheriff Lena Groves parked her cruiser and stepped out, boots crunching softly on the gravel. She had come to speak with someone who might hold the next missing thread, a man who had once known Tom Whitaker better than almost anyone. His name was Daniel Kraus. Back in the early 90s, Dan and Tom had been inseparable. They'd grown up 2 blocks apart, shared a love for fishing, engine grease, and jazz records. Don had even been Tom's best man. But sometime after the wedding, their friendship frayed and faded, like so many do, and eventually Dan had retreated to this house, rarely venturing far beyond it. Sheriff Groves had called the night before and left a message, and when he answered the door now, his eyes were wary but not unfriendly. Dan was in his late 50s, with a thick grey beard and deep-set eyes that held too many yesterdays. He waved her in with a grunt, leading her through a cluttered hallway into a living room filled with records and old photographs. "So," he said, lowering himself into a recliner with the stiffness of age and regret, "you found them?" Groves nodded, perching on the edge of a worn armchair. "We found the car. Tom and Grace were inside, but they weren't alone. They had a baby with them, Dan, a son." Dan didn't move, but something flickered behind his eyes. "Lucas," he said. Groves froze. "You knew?" Dan let out a long breath, running a hand down his beard. "Not until a few weeks after they disappeared. I got a letter in the mail. No return address, just my name. Inside was a photographed Grace and the baby, and a note from Grace. Said they were running. Said they didn't know who to trust. Told me to keep that photo safe, in case anything they ever happened to them." He stood and walked to a small metal filing cabinet in the corner, pulling open a drawer. From beneath a stack of old receipts, he withdrew an envelope yellowed with age. "I never told anyone," he said, as he handed it to Groves. "Didn't want to make things worse if they were hiding. But now." Groves opened the envelope carefully. The photograph inside matched those found in the briefcase. Grace, with the baby on her lap. Tom behind her, smiling but tired, as if they'd driven through the night. The letter was short, no more than a few sentences. "Dan, if you're reading this, something may have gone wrong. We're scared. Dean knows. Please protect Lucas if we can't. He's everything." Groves looked up. "You knew about Dean?" Dan's jaw tightened. Everyone knew about Dean. That man had a fuse shorter than a firecracker in July. Hated Tom for being the golden boy. Hated their dad for cutting him off. "I heard rumors he was following them. I didn't believe it at first. Thought it was just talk. But now," he sat back down, exhaling hard, "I think Dean found them. I think he waited until they were alone. Did something terrible. Took the baby." Groves leaned forward. "Do you think Dean would have raised Lucas himself?" Dan shook his head slowly. "Not a chance. Dean didn't have a nurturing bone in his body. But he had a cousin in Oregon, Marie. She was always trying to have a child, but couldn't. I remember Tom telling me about her once. Said she'd do anything to be a mother. Maybe Dean brought Lucas to her, passed him off as someone else's baby." Groves made a note. "Do you have her last name?" "Used to be Feldman," Dan said, scratching his head. "Lived in Medford. Back then, might have married since. But she worked at a dental office, I think." That was enough. A lead, at last. Something tangible. Groves stood, heart racing. "Dan, thank you. You may have just helped bring this full circle." He looked at her, something close to pain in his eyes. "If he's still alive, you tell him he had a father who loved him, and a mother who would have moved heaven and earth to keep him safe. You tell him that." Outside, the morning had brightened into a crisp, cloudless day. Groves climbed into her cruiser and pulled out her phone, dialing the department's research analyst before the engine even started. "Run every record you can find on a Marie Feldman," she said. "Focus on Medford, Oregon, but expand if needed. Cross-check with adoption records, pediatric files, and DMV changes. We're looking for a woman who suddenly started raising a child around late 1998, a baby boy possibly under a new name." Her voice was steady, but inside, her thoughts spun faster than ever. If Marie had taken Lucas, raised him, renamed him, then he might not even know he wasn't her biological child. He could be living a perfectly normal life, never questioning where he came from. But that life was built on the silence of others. And now, the silence was breaking. As she turned onto the main road and headed back toward Reading, the sheriff couldn't help but glance into the rearview mirror, as if expecting to see Tom and Grace sitting there, watching over the road ahead. Maybe, in some way, they were. Maybe their final act hiding their child leaving behind clues was what would finally bring their story to a close. Somewhere out there, Lucas Whittaker, though he may go by another name, now was living a life, shaped by choices not his own, but that was about to change. The past had waited long enough. The next 72 hours unfolded in a blur of files, phone calls, and quiet urgency. Sheriff Lena Groves had never felt time slip so quickly between her fingers. The lead on Marie Feldman had ignited something in her team, a fragile but glowing hope that perhaps, after all these years, they weren't chasing a ghost, they were on the verge of finding a man who had been living someone else's story. Marie Feldman's name pulled up a handful of public records, mostly older: a dental assistant in Medford, Oregon, a one-bedroom home purchased in 1998, cash sale, no marriage license on file, no children registered under her name. But in 1999, a change appeared. Marie had filed for a legal name change for a minor, Elijah Dean Feldman, male, date of birth, listed as June 10, 1998. The pieces clicked together so suddenly Groves sat down hard in her chair, heart pounding. She stared at the screen, hands trembling slightly. The name wasn't Lucas Whittaker, but the birth date matched, and so did the location. Elijah, that was him. It had to be him. She called the analyst back immediately. "Get me everything on Elijah Dean Feldman," she said. "Credit history, driver's license, employment, education, social media, anything and everything." Within an hour, they had a digital portrait of the boy who had grown up in the shadows of another name. Elijah was now 26. He'd graduated from a community college in Eugene with a degree in automotive engineering. He worked as a mechanic at a local repair shop called Nate's Auto and Tire. No criminal record, no military service. Quiet, online presence, no marriage, no children. Just a clean, ordinary life, tucked away in the piney edges of Oregon's countryside. Groves studied his DMV photo carefully. He had dark hair, strong cheekbones, and something in his eyes, something familiar. She pulled out a photo of Tom Whittaker, one taken from their wedding album. The resemblance was striking. There was no longer any question. Elijah Dean Feldman was Lucas Whittaker. She sat back, staring at the evidence wall that now practically vibrated with connections. The red string stretched from the grave of the car, to Grace's letter to the cousin in Oregon, to the boy who had grown into a man never knowing the truth. But now came the hardest part, telling him, how do you walk into someone's life and inform them that the people who raised them weren't who they claimed to be, that his biological parents had been buried in secret for over 2 decades, that his name wasn't really Elijah, that his entire identity had been shaped by a man who might have murdered his real parents. It wasn't something that could be done by phone or email. It needed to be face-to-face, personal, respectful. She decided she would go herself. Early the next morning, Groves climbed into her unmarked SUV and began the long drive north. The road to Medford, winding through tall forests and fog valleys. She reviewed the file on the passenger seat again and again, memorizing the timeline, the photos, the facts. But the facts didn't prepare her for what she would feel when she finally pulled up outside the modest garage on the outskirts of town. Nate's Auto and Tire sat at the corner of 2 rural roads, its signage faded but sturdy. The sound of compressed air and metal clanking filled the air. She stepped inside, the scent of oil and rubber wrapping around her like a memory. A young man in grease-stained coveralls looked up from beneath the hood of a truck and wiped his hands on a rag. "Be with you in a sec," he said. Groves took a step forward. Elijah Feldman. He turned, and when their eyes met, it hit her like a jolt. He had Grace's eyes, wide, perceptive, quietly searching. "Yeah," he replied. "Can I help you?" She extended her hand. "I'm Sheriff Lena Groves. I've come a long way to speak with you. It's about your family." He raised an eyebrow, cautious. "You sure you've got the right guy?" She nodded slowly. "I believe I do, but I think it's time you heard some things about where you came from, about your parents, your real ones." His face changed then, just slightly, a tension behind his jaw. He looked toward the open bay door, then back to her. Think you'd better come inside." They sat in the cramped break room, the buzz of a vending machine humming beside them. Groves laid the file on the table and opened it slowly. She began at the beginning. Tom and Grace Whittaker, their disappearance in 1998, the discovery of the buried car just weeks ago. She told him about the baby Lucas, about the photographs, the DNA matches, the forged birth certificate. She told him about Dean and Marie, and the letter Grace had written. Elijah didn't speak for a long time. He simply stared down at the photo of Grace holding him as a baby, her face soft with joy. "I knew I was adopted," he said at last. "Marie never lied about that. But she always told me my mother died in childbirth, that my father left me at a hospital, that I didn't have any family." Groves's voice was gentle. "That's not what happened. Your parents loved you, Elijah. They were trying to protect you, and something terrible happened to them. But you survived. You made it." He looked up at her then, and his voice cracked. "So who am I, really?" Groves didn't hesitate. "You're Lucas Whitaker, and you have a name, a family, and a history that belongs to you, if you want it." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full of the weight of years, of hidden truths finally unearthed, of a life quietly shattered but now, perhaps, being pieced back together. Outside, the sun dipped low behind the trees, casting long shadows on the asphalt. Inside, a young man sat staring at a photo of a mother he never knew and beginning to understand who he truly was. That night, Elijah didn't go home. After Sheriff Groves left, he sat alone in the garage's break room, long after the sun had dipped below the pine-lined horizon, long after the shop had locked its doors and the last car had been picked up. The photo of Grace remained in his hands, her soft eyes forever gazing at a child she had named Lucas, the child she never got to raise. Her smile was not just love, it was trust, frozen in time, as if she had looked ahead and believed that, somehow, despite everything, her son would be okay. Elijah Lucas, he wasn't sure what to call himself anymore, leaned back in the chair and let the silence stretch. His whole life had changed in a single afternoon. He had gone from a man with a simple job, a quiet life, and a few questions about his past to the center of a story far older and heavier than anything he could have imagined. And somewhere inside him, a name was starting to rise: Lucas. It felt strange, familiar, right. The next morning, he drove through the fog-heavy Oregon roads, not to work, not to his small rented apartment, but toward something deeper, a place where questions might have answers. Sheriff Groves had given him the address of Eleanor Franklin, his maternal grandmother, the woman who had helped bring him into the world, and then spent over 2 decades wondering where he'd gone. As he pulled up to the assisted living facility and stepped out of his truck, his heart pounded with the strange rhythm of memory and anticipation. He wasn't sure what he would say. He wasn't even sure what he wanted to feel, but something in him needed this. The nurse greeted him at the front desk and led him through a corridor that smelled faintly of lavender and age. Eleanor was waiting in the sunroom, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes cast out toward the courtyard garden. She turned as he entered, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. Then, slowly, she rose from her chair, her lips parting in a breath that never fully came out. "You look like her," she whispered. "You look just like Grace." He nodded, swallowing a lump in his throat. I think I'm Lucas." She walked toward him with the delicate steadiness of someone used to holding pain gently, and when she reached him, she took his hand in both of hers. "No," she said, tears rising in her eyes. "You are Lucas." He sat with her for hours. They talked of Grace, what she was like as a girl, how she laughed, how fiercely she loved. Eleanor told him about the night he was born, how his cries had filled the old house with something sacred, how Grace had whispered his name over and over like a prayer. She spoke of the guilt she had carried all these years, of the silence she thought would protect him but only deepened the loss. And Lucas, no longer calling himself Elijah, not in his heart, listened, not with resentment, but with the yearning of a man stitching himself back together through the sound of his own origin. Afterward, he drove to the sheriff's office. Groves was in her office, reviewing final DNA confirmation paperwork. When he knocked and stepped inside, she looked up, surprised at first, then nodded quietly. "You made it," she said. "Yeah," Lucas replied. "I did." He sat down and looked at her. "Steady now. I want to know everything. I want to see where they were found. I want to see the car. I want to understand how it happened, not just the facts, but the feeling of it. They were my parents, and I don't want to be a mystery anymore." Groves handed him the folder without hesitation. "You've got every right to know," she said, "but you should know it won't be easy. Some of it is dark. Some of it will never make sense. But it's all yours." He flipped through the pages, slowly, photos of the car, the dirt that had buried it, the briefcase, the letter from Grace. He paused longest over that letter. He read it once, twice, then folded it carefully and placed it into his jacket pocket. "This is the only thing she ever gave me," he said quietly, "and it's enough." Later, she took him out to the site. The pine trees stood tall around them, the air hushed with reverence. The car had been removed, but the clearing remained, a small depression in the forest floor where time had hidden to lives and a secret to long buried. Lucas stood there a long time, letting the breeze move through his hair, letting the soil beneath his feet speak its quiet truths. He didn't cry, he didn't fall apart, but he felt something loosen inside, a knot he hadn't known was there. Finally, "They were trying to protect me," he said, "and now I get to live because of it." That evening, he filled out the paperwork at the county clerk's office. Legal name change, Elijah Dean Feldman to Lucas Thomas Whitaker. The woman behind the counter looked at him curiously. "Big change," she remarked. He smiled softly. "You have no idea." And when she handed him the pen and he signed the line that reclaimed everything, it wasn't just ink on paper, it was a bridge, built back to the past and forward into something new. The name Dean Whitaker had long been a ghost in dusty police files and faded family memories, a name spoken more often with bitterness than grief. But now, for Lucas Whitaker, the man who had haunted his past was no longer a vague shadow, it was central, a hinge on which his entire life had once turned. As Lucas sat in Sheriff Groves's office that grey October morning, he stared at the folder marked Dean Whitaker Archived. It looked unassuming, just a few dog-eared pages and a faded photograph clipped to the front. But inside it lived, truths that had shaped decades. Groves sat across from him, her elbows on the desk, eyes searching his face carefully. "You sure you want to go through this?" she asked. "There's no going back once you open this door." Lucas nodded slowly. "He may be gone, but what he did isn't. I need to understand who he was, what he did to them, what he did to me." Groves opened the folder and began reading aloud, her voice measured, her pace respectful, as if she were walking through a graveyard. Dean Whitaker was born in 1965, the eldest of the two Whitaker brothers. From early childhood, school records painted the picture of a volatile boy, quick temper, frequent fights, disciplinary issues that only escalated with age. His younger brother, Tom, had been his opposite, quiet, thoughtful, responsible. That contrast only deepened their rift as the years passed. In interviews recorded back in the 90s, old friends and neighbors described Dean as hard-edged, always looking for trouble, and the kind of guy who couldn't stand being second to anyone. When their father Leonard died in 1996, the family estate was split, at least legally, but Dean believed Tom had manipulated their parents into cutting him out of the trust fund, and from that day on, he harbored a simmering grudge that never cooled. "There were threats," Groves said, pointing to a faded police report. "Tom reported that Dean showed up drunk at their house one night in '97, pounded on the door, said things like, 'You took everything from me. Maybe I'll take something of yours.' At the time, it was treated as a family dispute. No charges were filed." Lucas clenched his jaw. "And no one thought that was a red flag?" Groves looked at him steadily. "There were a lot of red flags. But the truth is, back then, unless someone got hurt, there wasn't much law enforcement could do about threats. Dean disappeared for a while after that, showed up in Montana, then Idaho, but he returned to Northern California in May of '98, right around the time your parents disappeared." Another report detailed a traffic stop in Eureka on June 15, 1998, just 5 days after Tom, Grace, and baby Lucas vanished. Dean had been pulled over for a broken taillight. The officer noted he was sweating, agitated, and there was a baby carrier in the back seat, but no baby. Dean claimed he was helping a cousin move. He was let go without further investigation. That single missed moment, the chance to ask one more question, to look twice, hung in the air like smoke. After that, Groves continued, Dean went completely off the radar until a year later, when he resurfaced in Medford. That's when Marie Feldman suddenly had a child in her care. No formal adoption papers, no birth records, just a forged set of documents and a new Namila. That same summer, Dean took a job under an alias and moved into a cabin 10 miles outside of town. He kept to himself. Locals remembered him as off, but no one reported anything serious. Then, in 2002, he died in a car crash just outside Ashland, single vehicle. He'd been drinking. Case closed. Lucas stared at the photograph attached to the report. Dean had deep-set eyes, a cruel mouth, and a scar that ran from his jaw to his neck, like a permanent sneer. "He raised me for a few years, didn't he?" Groves nodded. "We think so. You would have been with him at least until you were 2, maybe 3, before he gave you to Marie. Maybe she threatened to report him, or maybe he thought it would be easier to disappear again. Either way, by the time you were old enough to remember anything, he was gone from your life. And maybe that was the only kindness he ever gave you." Lucas didn't answer. He stared out the office window, watching the wind rattle the golden leaves. What kind of man takes a baby from his dead brother and passes him off like a burden? What kind of man buries his own family like trash and goes on living like nothing happened? Groves let the silence settle before responding. The kind of man who couldn't stand to lose, who saw everything as a contest, even blood. They closed the file, but its weight lingered in the room. Lucas rose slowly, still processing, still absorbing the sharp truth of it all. "I'm not going to let his name be the last chapter in my story," he said. "He tried to erase them, tried to rewrite everything, but I'm still here, and I'll carry their names, not his." Groves watched him leave, her chest tight with something between admiration and sorrow. She had seen survivors before, but not like this, not someone whose very life had been built atop a crime so carefully hidden, so cruelly designed. And yet here he was, not asking for revenge, not demanding restitution, just the truth, just the story, just his own name. Later that night, Lucas sat by himself with the folder once more, this time at his small kitchen table. He looked at every page, every report, every sentence, and when he finished, he folded the cover shut, leaned back in his chair, and whispered softly to the night, "You lost, Dean. I'm still here." Somewhere beyond the walls, the wind carried his words into the dark, past the trees, past the graves, past all the lies that had once buried him, but not anymore. The sun broke through the pine trees with a golden clarity the morning Lucas returned to the evidence room. Sheriff Groves had called him earlier than expected, her voice quiet but charged. "You need to come in. There's something we missed." In the briefcase, the words echoed in his mind the entire drive. He didn't know how many more shocks his soul could absorb, but something told him this one would be different. Not just facts or files or another name from the past, but something more personal, more intimate. Something from her. He arrived just after 7, the station still yawning awake, coffee brewing in the break room, morning reports being filed. Groves was waiting in the evidence room, the old leather briefcase open on the table. "I don't know how we overlooked it," she said, "but sometimes the smallest things are the most hidden." She handed him a sealed envelope, aged and yellowed, thin but firm in the hand. His name, Lucas, was written on the front, in soft, curving ink. It was wedged in the false bottom of the briefcase, she added. "Behind the lining. We only found it after the lab finished their final sweep." He didn't answer, he didn't breathe. He simply stared at the handwriting until his fingers moved on their own, breaking the seal and unfolding the pages inside. Words began with his name. "My dearest Lucas, if you are reading this, it means you found us somehow. Against the odds, against all the fear and silence, you found your way back to who you are. And that alone means everything. I wish I could be the one to tell you these things in person, to hold your face in my hands and see the man you've become. But if this letter is all I can give you, then I wanted to carry my voice, my heart, everything I was never able to say. You were born in the soft light of early morning, your cry loud and defiant and beautiful. I held you against my chest and promised you that no matter what the world tried to take, you would always know love. Your father, Tom, was terrified and ecstatic all at once. He kissed your forehead 1,000 times that day. We named you Lucas, Thomas Whitaker, and it felt like speaking something holy, but we were not safe. I don't know how much you'll discover, or what will be left after time and silence, but your Uncle Dean, he was dangerous. I never understood the depth of his anger until it was too late. When we told him about you, he turned cold, said things that made my blood run cold. I tried to believe he'd let us go, but I knew better. That's why we left. That's why we hid. Not because we didn't want you to know your family, but because we wanted you to have a life. I'm writing this as fast as I can, during a moment when Tom has gone out to get supplies and you're napping by the window. There's not much time, and there's so much to say. If we don't make it, if something happens, please know that we tried. We tried so hard to keep you safe. Everything we did was for you, And if you're holding this letter, then some part of that effort must have worked. I hope you were loved. I hope someone held you when you were scared and laughed when you learned to walk. I hope someone read to you at night and told you stories when you asked where you came from. Even if they didn't know the truth, I hope they gave you warmth and safety and enough love to build a life on. But if they didn't, if you spent too many nights wondering, then I hope this letter can heal even a corner of that ache. Because you were wanted, you were loved with every beat of my heart, and your father's too. Lucas, you are stronger than the world around you. I know this because I felt it the moment I first looked into your eyes. You carry our blood, our hope, our second chance. If you choose to take your name back, to speak it proudly, then you carry us with you into the light. You are not alone. You never were, not even now. With all the love in my soul. Mum, the paper trembled in his hands, not from weakness but from the storm that rose in his chest. Tears slid down his face without shame. It wasn't just a letter, it was a reunion, a final embrace through time and silence. Her voice was so alive in those words that for a moment he felt her presence beside him, smelling faintly of lavender, humming the same tune she'd once sung by his cradle. Groves didn't speak. She didn't need to. She stepped back, giving him space. Her own eyes missed it. Lucas folded the letter slowly and placed it against his chest. She knew, he whispered. She knew I'd find her. She believed in me, even back then. Groves nodded. She gave you the truth, and now you get to carry it forward. He turned to her. Can I have the original? She nodded. It's yours. Always was. Later that day, Lucas walked to the cemetery where his parents were now buried together. The town had quietly donated the plot, and Sheriff Groves arranged for the headstone. Grace, Evelyn Whitaker, and Thomas Allen Whitaker, devoted parents, never forgotten. Lucas knelt at the grave, placed the letter beneath a smooth stone at its base, and whispered a promise that he would live with intention, with courage, and with love. The wind rustled through the pine needles like her voice calling through time, and for the first time in his life, Lucas knew exactly who he was. In a town like Reading, where the wind carries more memories than news, and the trees have watched generations rise and fall, stories don't die, they go quiet. They wait, they settle in the dust of barbershop chairs, linger in the folds of diner booths, whisper from the corners of old church pews. And when Lucas Whitaker walked through the doors of the town hall that early November morning, word had already spread softly, like wind chimes in the breeze, that the boy who vanished had returned, and that the truth had come with him. Sheriff Groves stood beside him as they stepped into the building's small auditorium, where folding chairs had been set up in neat rows, and a projector hummed quietly near the back wall. There was no press, no flashing cameras, just neighbors, some strangers to Lucas by face but not by name, grey-haired couples who remembered Tom and Grace from church, shopkeepers who had once waved at Grace as she pushed a stroller down Main Street, former classmates of Tom who had watched the years pull apart what once was close. At the front of the room, a large framed photo of Tom and Grace stood beside a bouquet of autumn flowers. Simple, Reverend Eleanor Franklin sat in the front row, her frail frame wrapped in a shawl the same pale blue as the dress Grace had worn. The day Lucas was born, her eyes never left him as he approached the podium. She didn't need to speak. Her presence was enough. Lucas took a slow breath, placing his hands on the wooden edge of the podium as he looked out at the faces gathered before him. I never expected to be here, he began, voice steady but quiet. I never knew them, not really. I was only a baby when they disappeared, and for most of my life, I didn't even know their names. He paused, letting the weight of that truth settle. But I know them now, and because of that, I'm standing here not just to remember what was lost, but to honor what survived. He told them about the search, about the discovery of the car buried deep in the woods, about the clues, the letters, the heartbreak. He didn't go into graphic detail. He didn't need to. The silence in the room told him they understood. What mattered wasn't the tragedy, it was the love behind the choices his parents had made, the strength of the community that still remembered, the truth finally rising through the cracks in time. They never gave up on me, he said. Even when they had to let me go, they believed I would find my way back, and I did, because of all of you. At the end of his speech, he reached into his pocket and pulled out Grace's letter, original, now encased in a protective sleeve. He read her words aloud, her voice folding gently over the room like sunlight through lace curtains. There wasn't a dry eye by the time he finished. When he looked up, The entire room had leaned closer, as if trying to feel her presence too. After the service, people came up to him in small clusters. An older man who had played softball with Tom in high school. A retired teacher who remembered Grace bringing cookies to a fundraiser. A woman who had lived 2 houses down and still remembered the sound of baby Lucas's laughter echoing from the porch. "We never stopped wondering what happened," she whispered. "And now, finally, we can let them rest." Outside, the autumn sun painted the sidewalks in long golden streaks as neighbors lingered in quiet conversation. Lucas stood beside Eleanor, who held his arm gently, her eyes shining with pride and sorrow. "They'd be so proud of you," she said softly. "You brought them home." He nodded, the chill of the wind brushing his cheeks like a breath from the past. "I just followed the pieces they left for me." Sheriff Groves approached, her badge catching the light. "You did more than follow," she said. "You gave their story back to this town, and maybe even gave it a better ending than we dared hope for." Lucas looked around at the people gathered, each of them a thread in the fabric of memory that had kept his parents alive in quiet ways for 26 long years. He realized then that this wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had loved them, everyone who had waited, everyone who now could grieve in peace. That afternoon, a memorial plaque was installed in the town's small park, beneath an old oak tree that Tom and Grace had once picnicked under. It read, "In loving memory of Thomas and Grace Whitaker, a love that endured beyond silence, a story carried home by their son." Lucas stood before it, with a stillness born of finality and beginning. He touched the metal gently, not to test its weight, but to feel its truth. Behind him, children laughed in the distance, chasing each other through falling leaves. Life continued, as it always would, but now, the silence had a voice. Now, the town had its answer. As the sun dipped low behind the hills and cast a golden glow over Reading, Lucas walked alone along the quiet streets, breathing in the crisp air, hearing the town's heartbeat for the first time, not as an outsider, not as a mystery, but as a son coming home. He knew there were still questions, still shadows that time would never fully erase, but what mattered most had been found. Not just the bodies, not just the names, but the story whole and finally heard. And somewhere, as the wind stirred the oak leaves above the plaque, he swore he heard his mother's voice again, soft, sure, and full of light, welcoming him home. When winter settled into the quiet corners of Reading, dusting the rooftops with frost and turning the breath of morning into silver clouds, Lucas Whitaker found himself walking more slowly through the days, not because he was lost, not anymore, but because he'd learned how much of life he had once walked past without knowing it. The air tasted different now, clearer somehow. The world no longer felt like something borrowed or fragile. It belonged to him again. For the first time, he wasn't just moving through a life someone else had written. He was writing his own. He stayed in town longer than he expected. At first, it was just to handle the final paperwork. The estate, modest though it was, had passed to him. There was a small savings account that had gone untouched for over 2 decades, still in Tom and Grace's names. Sheriff Groves helped navigate the legal red tape. Eleanor, though weakening each day, was filled with a quiet peace she hadn't known in years. "Now I can go when it's time," she told Lucas one afternoon, her hand warm in his, knowing, "You're not lost anymore." Lucas rented a small cabin just outside of town, not far from where the car had been found. He didn't need much, just space, quiet, a place to feel their memory and honor it with presence. The forest, once a place of hiding and silence, had become a space of healing. He would walk the trails at dusk, pausing where the earth had once held a terrible secret, now cleansed by time, truth, and light. Sometimes he carried Grace's letter in his pocket. Other times, he brought a small notebook and wrote letters of his own words, not to the past, but to the future. He began volunteering at the local youth center, fixing up old bikes, teaching basic auto repair. The kids were rough-edged, some broken in ways that reminded him of his own invisible scars. But they responded to him, maybe because they saw in him someone who understood silence, or maybe it was just the way he listened with his whole being, never rushing, never judging. One boy, 13 and angry, asked him once why he didn't just leave, why he stayed in a town that had buried his parents. Lucas had looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Because this is where my story begins, and if I leave now, I'm just running again. I think I'm done running." He reclaimed his birth name legally. And slowly, the people around Town began using it without hesitation. Lucas, the name felt full now, no longer foreign or delicate, but rooted. He visited the cemetery every Sunday, sometimes bringing flowers, sometimes just sitting on the bench beneath the oak tree, letting the wind speak what words couldn't. He spoke to Tom in his mind, wondering what kind of man his father might have been, what kind of advice he'd have given about women or work or life. He spoke to Grace, imagining the sound of her laugh, the way she might have sung him to sleep as a child. They weren't ghosts to him anymore, they were anchors, and that changed everything. One snowy afternoon, Sheriff Groves joined him on one of his walks. They didn't talk much, just moved together through the woods, boots crunching on the frozen path. Eventually she asked, "Do you think you'll ever leave?" He paused, considering, "Maybe someday, but not until I've made something good here, not until I've left something better behind than what was taken." She nodded, and they walked on, two souls bound by truth, resilience, and a story neither of them had ever expected to finish. By spring, Lucas had applied to a regional grant to start a foundation in his parents' names. The Grace and Tom Whitaker Fund would provide scholarships for at-risk youth in Shasta County, kids who'd grown up without stable families, without answers, without someone to believe in them. The first scholarship was awarded to a girl who had aged out of foster care but dreamed of becoming a nurse. Lucas handed her the certificate himself, smiling as she burst into tears. "They would have wanted you to have this," he told her, and he meant every word. The community supported the project without hesitation. Local businesses donated tools, retired teachers volunteered to tutor, someone anonymously paid to have a mural painted on the side of the youth center, a vibrant portrait of trees, sun, and a winding road with the words, "Truth lights the way," stitched into the roots. Years passed, and with them, the town changed, but Lucas remained. He aged into his name like a second skin, never forgetting the years he'd spent searching, the lives lost to silence. He never remarried, never had children of his own, but he mentored dozens. And when people asked about his story, he told it not to evoke pity, but to remind them of what it meant to reclaim a life. Sometimes, when the wind blew through the trees just right, he would close his eyes and hear it again, that soft voice from a letter long ago, his mother's love, echoing through time, and he would smile, not in sadness, but in peace, because she had been right. He had made it home. And so, from a buried car in the forest to a life rebuilt on truth. This story reminds us that even the deepest pain can lead to powerful healing, and that love, no matter how long lost, always finds a way back. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this journey. Your time, your attention, and your heart mean more than words can say. If this story moved you in any way, we invite you to subscribe to the channel, give this video a thumbs up, and most importantly, leave a comment below. Share your thoughts, your feelings, or even a personal story this reminded you of. We read every single one, and your words truly help build the community where these powerful stories live on. Until next time, take care of your heart, hold your loved ones close, and never stop believing in the strength of the human spirit.